Hi, everybody. It's Mary Rowe from the Canadian Urban Institute. Thanks for joining us for yet another installment of City Talk. What a sobering slide that is, that opening slide that we're using for today. Just have you ever seen that street so desolate? It's a remarkable thing that we're witnessing. It also gives us a chance to see things perhaps we've never seen before because there are fewer people, and so we can all of a sudden maybe spend more time looking at the buildings. But I just think it's a remarkable indication of what we're up against here. And I know that across the country, cities and communities are in different stages of the second wave arriving, and that is reminding us once again that we have frontline workers and emergency service workers whose lives are at stake, trying to keep us safe and keep people healthy. And so we have these conversations to make sense of what's going around us, but we always want to be cognizant that there are many people, thousands of people who are devoting their time and their efforts and their putting themselves at risk actually to continue help Canadian cities stay safe. So I always want to acknowledge that. These broadcasts are national. We're appreciative of people coming in across the country and often from the United States and Europe. But here in Toronto, where these broadcasts originate, it's the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and the Chippewa. And it's home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit folks. We're also part of Treaty 13, which was signed, under Treaty 13, which was signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties that were signed with multiple Anishinaabe nations. We've been struggling here at the Canadian Urban Institute and with our colleagues through City Talk about how urbanism needs to do better and how urbanism needs to confront and address systemic inequality that our practices have in fact reinforced. And that's the legacy of racism and discrimination and exclusion that has disproportionately affected people of color and people from Indigenous communities. And so we're coming to terms with that, and we're trying to struggle together and understand how we need to change the way we've been doing things and who's been doing those things, I guess, is the critical thing too. So Sunday was COVID 200. We're marking these every 200 days. Maybe 100 days ago, we thought that we were in for a sprint, thought we would kind of turn the corner and maybe summer would bring us a different kind of prospect or future. And now here we are, COVID 200, and settling in for another battle, I think. So it's more of a marathon than a sprint. And joining us today to help us make sense of this are esteemed folks who are living and breathing this stuff. And we're really appreciative to have Sadhu and Jay and Ken come and be part of a conversation with us about what does that 200-day mark mean for them, for their constituencies, for the things that they're concerned about and the challenges they see and also the opportunities. Remembering on the chat that we encourage people to participate on the chat. Remember that these sessions get videotaped and then posted online a couple of days later, and the chat will be also. So as I always say, remember what goes in the chat stays in the chat, so just keep that in mind. But feel free to raise questions there and feel free to respond to one another, which is often what happens. It's a whole parallel universe of folks in the chat, which is great. And we'll have lots of chances to get clarification from people if you have questions about the report or if you have questions of the panelists as they offer their responses. Just throw them into the chat and I'll do my best to feed them in. Last thing is that I want to introduce our Director of Research, Andre Cote, who's actually going to run us through a sort of a summary of the report. You can find it at canurb.org, COVID 200, you'll be able to read it there. And I should just say at the outset that we are so lucky. We have so many organizations that are tirelessly partnering with CUI to support our work, our mandate to create connective tissue across the country on what's happening in urban Canada. And one of the lead partners that we have is Avanis, which is a research company, a market research company that did all the survey work here, 90,000 Canadians. They did the same, they did a data search for us for the COVID 100 report, and they continued on with COVID 200, 90,000 Canadians that they've been surveying and collecting detailed urban level racial and ethnic data from the beginning, which unfortunately is not remotely common. It's one of the things that we surfaced in COVID 100 and we're saying again in COVID 200 is that we need this data to really understand the impacts. And we've had all sorts of resistance to that. I can see Sadhu nodding. He's probably going to talk a little bit about how the city of Vancouver has been trying to move forward on that. So I want to just say once again, thanks to Gary Offenberger, who's in the background and providing us with tremendous technical support and data support. And then Andre, who stepped in to be our acting director of research. Previously, it was Kate Graham, and she had the nerve to go and have a baby. And so Andre stepped in and he coordinated the effort, which was a lot of folks producing COVID 200. So Andre, I'm going to pass to you, and then I'm going to come back. Jay and Sadhu and Ken, we're going to turn our videos quiet, but don't forget to come back, because I'm going to chat with you after Andre runs us through a summary of the report. So over to you, Andre, and I'll see the three of you back with Andre when he's finished. Over to you, Andre. Thanks.
Sure. Thank you, Mary. Well, first off, it's a pleasure to be here with the panelists. You're correct. I'm the sad replacement for Kate Graham, but hopefully we've done an okay enough job with this report. And so what I'll do right now is just walk everyone through some of the highlights. And then hopefully that'll help to frame up our conversation to follow. So I will share my screen. Okay. So COVID's Signpost 200 days, building resilience to confront deepening urban crises. So the report came out yesterday, as Mary noted. A first question people might have, why Signpost? Why have we labeled this series Signpost? I think we thought it was perhaps the right metaphor for what we were trying to do. A signpost often at a crossroads, helping to direct travelers, providing guidance or clues on an unclear or complicated issue. So that felt pretty true to the moment we're in, or the period we've been in this year with COVID. The report itself, so 200 days since the World Health Organization declared the global pandemic. It follows the first Signpost report, with the idea being to take a fresh look at how COVID's impacts on urban Canada have progressed. What we were trying to do in the report was look at some of the trends, the major developments or events, but also to the extent that it's possible to explore the sort of the lived experience of people across the country in cities through the pandemic, and through that to also identify some of the sort of signals and the noise as we look ahead. Importantly, it's been informed by public health data, which I'll add has been a bit challenging collecting the COVID data across all the cities in the country. But as Mary noted, we've been hugely supported through Advantis as our I guess opinion research partner, and so their survey of 90,000 Canadians really helped to provide a picture of how this has been going for people that we really wouldn't likely have been able to show otherwise. I think also important, a few of the things CUI has ramped up through the pandemic, the City Watch, City Share, this City Talk platform, as well as the Bring Back Main Streets initiative, all have contributed really interesting sort of data and stories about how this crisis has been unfolding in urban Canada and what we can do about it. And then the last thing I'd note, so the main report is complemented by a series of 7 regional profiles that provides regional perspectives, I should say, that provide perspectives from the major provinces or regions of the country. So really interesting pieces. Encourage you to check those out as well. So the first thing we looked at was the actual progression of the pandemic in urban Canada. And so I think, it's interesting in a way we're sort of living day to day, week to week through this. And it feels like we're in a bit of a bleak moment now as there's talk of the second wave. But I think, as we look back over the last 100 days, it's important to note that it's actually been comparatively managed well in Canada and across our major cities. We had largely managed down the curve, or we'd seen a serious deceleration of the rate of growth in cases, and in particular in the rate of deaths since the day 100 mark. Just to give you a sense of that, we had about 100,000 cases at day 100. As of day 200, we're at about 150,000, so about half the rate of growth. And even more importantly, there were about 8,300 deaths at day 100s, and we're currently at about 9,300. So again, serious slowing of the rate of growth there, which is positive. The numbers continue to show that the crisis has been primarily in urban Canada. So with just under 50% of the population across the major cities, north of 70% in terms of the number of deaths. There's been large variation across regions. So, for example, Quebec continues to be the region that has seen the disproportionate level of impact. And then on the other end of the spectrum, parts of the country like Prince Edward Island or the territories have seen very little impact from the virus, at least, and have yet to report a death. So very different experiences that way with the virus. In terms of population groups, continues to be concentrated within certain populations, in particular the 60 plus, even though there has been a lot of talk lately about increasing numbers of cases amongst younger peoples. And then finally, the surging second wave. Obviously, while there's some good news in the bullets above or in terms of the last 100 days, the second wave obviously should have us quite concerned as we look ahead. So the report then got into what's happened in urban Canada over the past 100 days. And so it covers a lot of ground. And so what I'll do is basically just highlight a few of the signs that we covered in the report. And hopefully that can be a bit of a jumping off point for the discussion. I think it's first important to note, again, there were a bunch of good things that happened over the past 100 days. The economy in our society, frankly, largely opened up across our cities. We saw our cities pivot really quickly with initiatives around tactical urbanism, for example, to enable patios to spring up and some of these positive things to take advantage of the warm summer weather. There were efforts to convert motels and hotels to support the surge in homeless populations. We saw the federal and provincial government step in with an emergency aid package for cities or for municipalities. So there were definitely a few good signs. I think, some other things we saw is this pandemic fatigue. One thing that the data showed was that Canadians are reporting that they are strictly practicing physical distancing less than they were at day 100. I think, potentially pandemic fatigue, potentially because of a bit of the success that we had where people were feeling maybe the risk profile is a little bit lower. But this is probably something we should be thinking about. People maybe not quite on guard as we head into this second wave. We saw the reinforcing of urban inequities. And so these are just a couple of indicators, but Black Canadians, for example, are reporting substantially higher rates of experiencing food shortages. Black and Indigenous peoples reporting greater impacts on their ability to pay rent. So some concerning indicators there, reinforcing some of the urban inequities. Continued economic hardship. Households across the country were reporting continued impacts on earnings, on employment, both individually and at the household level, on savings and investments. A lot of this has been reinforced through the Statistics Canada labor force surveys that have shown continuing high numbers of high rates of unemployment and a range of other continuing impacts through the crisis. A lot of this appears to be contributing to a rising toll on mental health. And so again, just a few indicators here, but a sense of feeling helpless about the COVID situation or moments of great panic or anxiety that people are reporting as a result of the pandemic. Another big one for cities, the transit ridership collapse. So the data we have shows that perhaps a little bit surprisingly for me at least, ridership has not really rebounded substantially since day 100 and since the period of the lockdowns. Sadhu might have a perspective on this, but the numbers from Vancouver seem in line with elsewhere, where it's still about 60% below where it was pre-pandemic, which is very concerning, I think, for municipalities and also generally for how we move in cities. And then finally, the financial and operational stresses on city governments. I think we've been collecting a bunch of interesting data through CityWatch, the CityWatch platform, about the emergency responses in cities across the country, in over 60 cities, and in how they've had to adapt services and other things like property taxes or revenue collection. And I think that, so this is just a snapshot of a few of the indicators for a few of the cities, but I think what it shows is that, firstly, the experience is a little bit different in different cities. The conditions on the ground are different, and so they're responding and reopening in different ways. And I think, secondly, a number of these things continue to be challenging cities. Some continue to have deferred property taxes, for example, with big financial implications through the second 100 days. So where did this leave us? So what were sort of the signals from the noise that we saw? A first big one was the threats to local economies, main streets and downtowns. I think this has been talked about a fair amount and is a big focus of our Bring Back Main Streets initiative. But in terms of the impacts on retail and restaurant businesses, for example, on local anchor institutions on main streets, and then with the emptying of downtowns, this is a huge concern for cities. The second is the continued deepening of systemic urban inequalities. Again, some of the data points to it. I think other things like the challenges we've seen with homelessness in cities are things that obviously very urgently need to be addressed. And then the last one, the failing financial and governance arrangements for cities. While federal and provincial governments have provided some emergency assistance, what I think this has reinforced, and we can probably discuss, is cities are in a box to a large extent with falling revenues, with increasing costs, and with balanced budget laws that are really going to constrain them. And so while there might be a bit of a short-term fix with some of this emergency aid, the question is, what does this look like next year and down the road? What are some more permanent fixes that might be needed? And then the last point is around this second wave, which is really, I think, a bit of the X factor. Obviously with public health and safety risks, but also with the potential to amplify a lot of these other things we're seeing in terms of the economic, social, or governmental pressures. And so I will leave with this. As Mary alluded to at the front, it feels like we're into this sort of new normal, and it's feeling right now, at least, that things might actually get worse before they get better, or at least we'll be with this for some time to come. And so the theme we landed on for this report was resilience, and the importance of maintaining and building resilience as we go forward, and the importance of that being done really at a local level, given that's where a lot of our strength is, I think, in urban Canada. So Mary, I will leave it there. Thank you. And I will stop sharing the screen.
The rest of us to come back on, that'd be great. Thanks very much for taking us through that. And I want to encourage people to go have a look at that report. There's a lot of detail, obviously, behind what Andre has just summarized. And Andre, take yourself off mute, because I know there will be lots of questions for you. Also, the other thing we did with this round is we actually asked our regional leads. We have folks that are working with COI in the West, in Calgary. So we have somebody in Victoria, someone in Calgary, someone in Winnipeg, someone in Gatineau and Ottawa, and someone in Halifax. And each of those folks wrote a regional perspective. And then Selena, our Director of Strategy, added one for Ontario. And then we have a colleague who also did one for the North. So those are really valuable. They're all at canurb.org, and they give you a sense of the common challenges, but then you also get a sense of what are the place-specific challenges. And each of those regional leads chose to highlight what they thought was really the seminal challenge that had emerged in the last 200 days. So we're trying to do a mix here of quantitative and qualitative research, so that we are backing ourselves up with really good informed data, but at the same time allowing ourselves to have opportunities to reflect on what we're actually seeing and perceiving in our communities. So the first thing I'd like to do then is I want to ask Ken to come and talk with us, because he is, Ken, you're a whole bunch of things. But, on City Talk, we're always quite quick about, we don't actually talk a lot about people's bios, and we put them into the chat. So we expect you all to Google these folks and figure out who they are. But Ken is a partner with Makespace Group, and he's a co-founder of Startup Edmonton. So he's going to give us a sense, I think, from the business community and from the startup community, what you're seeing. So I'm going to suggest we go to Ken first, then I'm going to come to Jay, and then Sadhu, I'll come to you at the end. But then we'll just have a free for all. So Ken, some initial reactions to what Andre's talked about and what they're reporting, just a general sense of what you're seeing in Edmonton.
Yeah, no, for sure. So, so our company, we've been doing a bunch of work out of Edmonton and also downtown Calgary over the last kind of like year or so. And, I think a big part of what, so we have a platform that we've been building called 1M, which is all about, what could you do with 1 million square feet? And I really like that sort of that last quote that you have, which is, resilience and sort of block by block. And, I think one of the biggest things and the challenges for our downtowns is really rebuilding momentum. I don't think it's a question of if people are coming back, but it's really how they're coming back and how they're reconnecting. And I think if what COVID has really sort of done very abruptly was to, create a disconnection between all of the people living and working in these buildings and then all of the businesses and the service providers that are in those downtowns. And then that sort of amplifies where the world was going in terms of, retail, real estate, et cetera, which was all of the business models were built around foot traffic and bums in seats. And it's not that wasn't where things were going before but the pandemic has really just accelerated where I think things are going. What's really been interesting that we've seen, there are two types of business owners. So I come from the sort of the startup community and the entrepreneurship sort of side. And you have business owners who are, not only trying to just keep the lights on, but some of them are really sort of thinking about, well, what is the future for what my business looks like? So I can't just be a restaurant owner. I have to become more of a culinary brand. So that might mean I'm doing a little bit of, I can't do dine-in experience, but I can start to create, delivery options. I can create packaged products. I can start sort of thinking differently about how I'm connecting with my customer within my local community too. So I think that that's the real opportunity for a lot of businesses and sort of downtowns, which is to kind of double down on the sort of the entrepreneurial component. So not just think about bringing volumes of people back into cities, but sort of starting, a project at a time, a business at a time, and helping those businesses grow by connecting them more tightly with the local community to help them build their businesses.
Yeah, this block by block notion is just how do we wrap our arms around something that's doable? And otherwise you just get overwhelmed and you just think, well, there's no point. I hear you on that. Yeah, question for you in terms of the community that you deal with in Edmonton, the business community. How are they coping with their workers, who were furloughed or who perhaps they qualified for CERB, or maybe they went to the emergency wage subsidy program, but have they had to offer extra support to their employees? How are they finding the transition to get those employees back, et cetera? Any thoughts on the struggles that has presented?
Well, I think that the tough thing about office and the workplace right now is inconsistency and sort of the uncertainty. And so a lot of the kind of conversation about office right now is, again, not should companies work from home or not. Like it's like a black or white sort of like conversation. But really, it's opened the door to more flexibility, which is where things were going in the first place. And now I think companies and building owners really have to sort of say, well, it's here now. And so what does that mean for our buildings and our sort of our workplaces? And I think for a lot of these companies, it's sort of thinking about how can we still be flexible? Where right now all the conversation is about kind of compliance and rules in the workplace, which people are just kind of trying to sort of, not kind of think beyond that. Like, what does the workplace look like when we're not talking about compliance and rules, and how far we sit next to each other?
Yeah, this is such a difficult thing, isn't it? I hear it in my friends and colleagues. People want some guidance and they want some rules. Is it 10 people? Is it 25 people? Is it this? But at the same time, you don't want people to not be innovative and imaginative about what they can do and and we know that there are businesses that have gone above and beyond. We know that there are businesses that have kept track of their workers when they were furloughed, who continue to provide income support to them. So we know there are good actors out there. The question, I think, for all of us is how do you highlight the good actors and inspire the laggards to do the right thing. Jay, let's go to you next in terms of your assessment. You're working with city builders across North America, so you have a broad network of folks that have been experiencing this in a really profound and disturbing way. So do you want to comment a little bit about your own perception of where we are in day 200, and then any specific comments you've got towards the COVID Signpost reporters just generally? Over to you.
Okay. I think to begin, and I want to say this in the most kind but very direct way, the language of opportunity in this moment is really vulgar. And it keeps getting used. And I'd like us to try to be mindful as we have this conversation, not to frame this tragedy using the word opportunity. We should be showing up in the spirit of accountability, service, and learning. Those are the words we should be using in this moment. So again, I guess, being connected to people on the front lines, to people who have been providing community care and direct design interventions, burying family and community members, try to imagine how people showing up talking about opportunity would ring in their ear. So let's be more respectful in that regard. And one of the things that I've noted in this moment is that while individuals on the front lines have been risking their lives or supporting people who are profoundly struggling, urbanists with a lot more privilege have been seizing opportunities, funding, platforms for speaking, publishing. And so I just, again, want to think about how that is happening. Just as proximity is important for containing COVID, proximity is also really important when it comes to properly framing the issues. And so if we're excluding people with lived experience, if they're not on formal record, so I don't mean a couple of tweets, I really mean on formal record, in terms of the interventions and the papers that are being published, this moment is not being properly or holistically captured and framed, and that means that the interventions will also fall short and perpetuate all of the inequities we're talking about, and that this report thankfully highlights for us. And I'll just have two other very quick points. The other point that I have is pertaining to a rush to solutions and resolution. Obviously, it's a crisis, so we have to move very quickly. But to the point that was highlighted in the report, people are dealing with tremendous mental health challenges in this moment that will not be resolved by a design intervention or a really smart article or research paper or even a vaccine later on. And so as we're sort of coming and bringing forth interventions, we really need to center mental health and healing in all of the work that we're doing. And, healing is not something that we talk about a lot within urbanism. And I think we're going to have to, if we really want to see deep restoration of cities. And as we're talking about mental health as well, I'd like us to not only talk about it as it pertains to COVID, but I'd like us to talk about it as it pertains to the civil rights uprising that's actually happening across cities concurrently. And so what I would like this report and this conversation to do a better job at is to be more intersectional in terms of naming COVID in the moment and the civil rights uprising that is happening concurrently as well. And just two other very quick points. One is that I've noted that we've become more aware when it comes to issues of social equity, especially race. We're having much more rich conversations pertaining to race in this moment. But as urbanists, we still really need to develop a capacity for having those conversations in a way that isn't ahistorical, apolitical, or incredibly uncomfortable. So we still have some work to do there. And we need to go from awareness to actual relationship building. So that's very important. And the final thing that I'll say is that, women and children have taken such an incredible hit during this pandemic that the only way we can see restoration of cities is by centering a spatial feminism lens, a gender equity lens, a gender-based violence lens. So I'd like to see more of a gender analysis being integrated in our conversations, even as we're talking about the downtown and the mainstream. The main streets, we know that women are more represented in informal businesses and small businesses as well. So when we talk about main streets or how the downtown will come back, I'd like us to use an intersectionality lens for that, so that we have a more complete conversation.
Right, we need complete neighborhoods and we need complete conversations. I hear you. In terms of the offensiveness of the word opportunity, which I hear, is I think is a better term, Jay, obligation. Because
absolutely, we have an obligation.
Right, because we do have this, I mean, opportunity can sound opportunistic and selfish, but it can also be there, we've got a moment to make things right and to do things differently. And so I had said a couple of months ago, I've been using hashtag no more excuses, but I was seeing it as the obligation we have. So on long-term care facilities, for instance, or on your term, forgotten densities, there is an opportunity to fix these things, but I hear you, that word it's loaded, right? So obligation would be the better word?
Yes.
Okay. And the intersectionality piece is fundamentally about places being for everyone, right? And how do we actually make sure that we're, as you just suggested, we need to have a complete conversation. There's no single path here. It has to be about all of these things all at once. And I appreciate your point that we can't rush it. Maybe one of the dilemmas we've had in urbanism is that there've been a lot of linear thinkers historically in urbanism who said, this is what we have to build.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's this very complicated challenge of responding very quickly, but also responding mindfully as well, and slowing down when we need to, and understanding. So again, in terms of making sure that these solutions or these interventions are very localized. And so that requires like trust earning and slower conversations. And so if we lead with interventions and quick fixes, which is kind of the way cities have evolved in many ways, we're going to, again, replicate past mistakes. And it's not prescriptive, it's very complicated to know when to move quickly and also when to slow down. But I would just say that if we approach it understanding that we have to be operating using 2 speeds, I think that's a good beginning.
Wow. 2 speeds at once. You know, I remember when I was in New Orleans after Katrina, and there was a whole constituency that thought the solution was get the army in there and just rebuild those neighborhoods. And there were a gazillion people saying, this is too messy, it's taking too long, it's too fraught, it's too complicated, let's just bring the army in. And fortunately that didn't happen, you know, but there is, as you're identifying, there is at some level an instinct to, we've just got to deal with this immediately. And so often we've done the wrong thing when we've done that, right? Mm-hmm. But it still puts an enormous challenge on our services then, that if we're not going to solve these problems quickly, we've got to figure out what's the interim way to cope and keep people as safe as possible. Okay.
And it's also, in reality, these problems have existed for a very, very long time.
Right.
So this is a false, like it's a false line, right? They've existed for a very long time. So, you know, another hour isn't going to profoundly change the course of history. So let's go down and do it right. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it does take a long time to build cities badly. So it's not quick to do it right. I hear you. Okay. All right, Sadhu, you have a big job on those shoulders of yours. You're at the epicenter of a part of the country that's dealing with multiple crises, exactly what Jay was suggesting. It's not just one crisis. You've got a number on your hands in terms of the city that you're the steward of, and interested in your perspective as we get into day 200, and also what your experience in Vancouver has been and continues to be as you deal with these multiple challenges, not only COVID. And as Jay suggested, all sorts of things that pre-existed COVID and have just been exacerbated. So we're interested to hear your perspective.
Yeah, thanks. I guess I'd say I agree with you on the COVID has exacerbated a lot of challenges, like crises that we've been facing. Some on the surface and some that haven't been talked about until more recently in the work that we've been doing. So the intersectionality, Jay, that you were just talking about is definitely something that we're facing. The city of Vancouver. COVID is definitely hitting a lot of areas that we've already talked about. I mean, the retail, the kind of the main streets and the arterial business sector is obviously really, really strained, and it was strained before, and now it's being hit even harder. Homelessness, poverty, addictions, generally challenges that we've been facing in our cities that are kind of a societal problem that we haven't really taken head on are being exacerbated, and to the point that we don't have the tools to handle them as cities. We are, in many ways, for the first time, really talking about the colonial system that our city is built out of and is still based on. I mean, all the laws, the land, tenure, all of that is really built out of a colonial structure, and we're still a part of it. And embedded deeply in that is a system of racism. And so we are a part of that system, and trying to figure out how to really have those conversations in the context of the COVID crisis is definitely stretching us and raising a lot of important questions and opportunities for learning and for change that are not easy. Meanwhile, we have an opioid crisis that's ravaging our city. We have a housing crisis. Home prices are going up still, and multiple offers on homes and way above asking. And so all these challenges, the crises that we've been facing way before COVID, are really coming to a head and asking important questions about what the basis of our laws are built off of, and our land tenure and whatnot. So very, very important challenges: poverty, homeless camps, many areas that we as cities don't have the tools to handle on our own. We don't have the funding to handle them on our own. We can't do them without the province and the federal government and nonprofits and all of us working together. And right now, I don't see that kind of partnership actually working. And so we often find ourselves trying to kind of talking into an echo chamber and not really being able to all talk together about how do we take on these systemic challenges, kind of the intersection of all of these issues. So a lot of really, really big challenges for our cities. And as a city manager, it's really frustrating to not feel like I can move the dial in solving many of these things. There are things that I'm really proud of in the context of this crisis, though. We've every single day we've picked up the garbage, we've delivered fresh, clean water to people. We've been able to handle all of our services as our workers get sick and struggle with how to get to work and whatnot. We've managed to continue to review permits and provide grants to nonprofits, all while our staff are working from home. And so to think, 200 days ago that we would be able to see this kind of transformation in how we deliver our services is really quite something. We've created 50 kilometers of slow streets, and we're seeing a lot more people getting out on their feet and on their bikes to get around, and have permitted 400 patios so businesses can find a way to continue to operate and people can still find ways to connect in a healthy way. So the challenge is pushing for innovation, and I hope that we're able to move, take this crisis that we're collectively facing, and really focus on solving some of the systemic problems that we have underlying a lot of these problems.
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if innovation is one of those words like opportunity that's heard as sort of the privileged group that look for innovation, and how do we have a conversation that's going to signal that we're more comprehensive and more holistic in our understanding here, and that equity is always part of our conversation. You have significant public health challenges in Vancouver, as you suggested, which actually predate COVID, and we're aware that the death from opioids is actually, I think, continues to be higher in BC than the deaths from COVID. Am I right?
Yeah, and they're going up. The isolation, people feeling they're going to stay in their rooms and not going to overdose prevention sites, and not being a part of the community that has been the peer supports that have helped to save lives. So the deaths from the opioid crisis are going up still, but safe supply is now a part of the mainstream conversation, recognizing that we do need to take a different approach to solving that problem. And that, I think, is, again, there are things that are coming out of this that we can learn from, and that are becoming more acceptable in the mainstream that weren't before, and conversations that are now happening more broadly than they were before, like taking on and recognizing the racism that exists, both within our organization, within our community.
I mean, the examples of sort of the municipal governments acting more quickly tend to get trivialized into just things like, oh, well, we got patios approved quickly and we got bike lanes approved quickly, which again just fuels this perception that cities are only about a certain privileged elite. But in terms of harm reduction, have you actually seen a more rapid advancement of those kinds of policies, which are socially progressive policies? Is that a benefit potentially from COVID, is that we'll just accelerate our progress on that file?
Well, I mean, as I was saying, safe supply has been something we've been advocating for a really long time, and now
you got it.
We have it, and now we need to drastically expand it, and so we're not there yet for sure, but it's definitely something that's come out of this that we can build off of to address a major challenges that we're facing in Vancouver, but cities and people are facing all over North America.
May I just note a contradiction, though? I think this is something to be so incredibly proud of, Sadhu, but I also think that it's incredibly important to underscore that in Vancouver and other cities across North America, there's been a very inequitable and contradictory approach, which is to have street interventions like bike lanes and open patios to facilitate folks like you and I being able to be outside enjoying the sun and on the streets, whilst also clearing off anybody who is street involved from the streets. So this assumption that public space is only, they're only sites where like middle class people with desirable presentation and conduct, like that, it's only for us. And then when we start talking about individuals who are street involved, we immediately go to their vulnerability. We don't talk about them as full people, right? So we're forcing homeless folks off of encampments. So something that is very important to me, and I'm working with Atira in Vancouver on this, but something that is very important to me is for us to imagine that people who are homeless, unhoused rather, or street involved, that they too want to experience community, social cohesion, joy, and beauty in the public realm. And municipalities, including Vancouver, but my city as well, every city across North America has done a terrible job at that. So we've created space for the middle class, myself included, right? Like for all of us, and not given a single thought about people who whose homes are on the streets or who are engaged in street involved activities. And it's always strictly using a social service lens, like there are only a number or are only a client, right? But we're not thinking about like walkability and belonging and beauty for those folks. And so cities have really failed on that front, and the reallocation of public realm and public space has actually just reinforced a lot of those inequities in terms of who gets to experience beauty and delight and social cohesion, when in fact in Vancouver, many of the people that you're talking about live in these tiny little rooms without stoves or kitchens. They can't have one person over in their home.
Yeah.
And so they really need the streets for their well-being, mental health, and also, to manage some of the issues around harm reduction as well.
Can I get a sense from Sadhu, and then Andre, I'm going to come to you, but do we have examples where we are seeing investments in public realm, not just in affluent neighborhoods, but are efforts being made to provide more equitable amenity improvements in neighborhoods that are where lower income folks live? Sadhu?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I definitely agree with Jay. That the natural tendency is to do that in affluent areas to support the middle class to still have a beer together. So that has been a major challenge for us, figuring out how to create that. And so we have been working to do it, to create cordon off areas on the street and put picnic benches and allow for areas where people can connect that might otherwise be living in a shelter or are living in the shelter or on the street, and can now have a meal on a picnic bench in the public area. But generally speaking, I would agree with Jay. That is a very much not the first step that was taken, and needs to be an area that we continue to push for sure.
Andre, do you want to comment a little bit about when you were collating the research? You were having to try to report on not just COVID. I mean, I think that's the dilemma that we're hearing now, is that this is only one crisis. There's a number of other crises that are concomitant with it. How did you balance that, and how do you imagine the next, I'm going to ask each of you, how do you imagine the next 100 days? We're heading into winter. I appreciate winter is experienced differently in different parts of this country, but can I get a sense from you as you were collating all the data, what was going through your head?
Sure. I mean, I think, what we were trying to do with the report was to the extent possible, provide a picture of how things have been going that are supported by evidence or by public opinion, basically something that we can stand behind to the extent possible, based on the major limitations in terms of real-time data about what's happening, the comparability of what we know across the country or even within cities, within communities. So it was, how to tell that story. And I mean, I've found, I think we've talked about this before, and with Jay as well, it's like, what's particularly challenging with this situation is we're going through immense amount of change in our cities and across our countries. And again, different community by community in some ways, even though there are some trends and patterns. And many of us as people are more isolated than we've ever been. And so I just find it's particularly challenging to have any real perspective when, I think most of us are doing this from our homes. We're not out in the world seeing people. So that would be my sense. And in terms of the go forward, I mean, I think, what we tried to do with those three areas was just sort of say, listen, there are just so many things happening. Where are the places that maybe in the very immediate term, but I think really looking out a few months, whether it's to the next signpost or into next year, what are the key areas where if things aren't being addressed, they can really reinforce these crises that we're seeing. And so that, our sense is local economies, main streets, downtowns, if our local economies fail, our tax base goes, there are just these ripple effects. I think similarly, the deepening of inequalities is hugely troubling and urgent, as well as requiring longer term solutions. And then finally, if our local governments are not in a position to be able to act on these things, we're in deep trouble. But this was just our perspective. I'm sure everybody would have their own list.
I mean, it's interesting for us, when we chose to focus on the street with Bring Back Main Street, and we, everyone seems to understand Main Street, whether you're part of a big urban center or you're in a smaller community. But Main Streets, as Jay pointed out and that Sadhu was reinforcing, Main Streets are about more than just going in for a shop. There's all sorts of things that go on. Some people live on the main street. Some people thrive on the main street. Some people protest on their streets. So it's such a critical, important part of the commons. And I wonder if we have an obligation to try to reimagine and reinvest in those main streets in ways that are inclusive. And so that, as Sadhu suggested, you could have, I worry about this in terms of stratification in urban environments. Public spaces have traditionally been the place where I encounter someone who is not like me. Mm-hmm. And that's the promise of the public realm. But as our neighborhoods have become more economically and racially divided, you don't bump into somebody who's not like you because they don't live near you. And are we going to run a risk, if transit fails, that we'll just become more and more insular and more hanging with just the people that we look like us and think like us? And Ken, do you want to just weigh in on that? And then I'm going to go around and ask people the next 100 days.
Yeah, for sure. It was funny when you brought up the term innovation. And when you sort of think about innovations, we're always sort of talking about the ideas, and the real magic is how do you sort of like take those ideas and be able to sort of put them into action. And I think what's happening in our cities right now too is removing that hierarchy from who does the city building.
Right.
And this is why sort of starting to move away from compliance and sort of rules, and everyone's sort of looking to cities to sort of solve the problem. And today, innovation just isn't technology, creating apps and new startups and stuff like that. But it's like, these are the tools that now empower citizens who are now, really emerging as like the true identity of cities, and now being able to sort of give them those opportunities and those platforms to go and take action. And I think a big thing that sort of has to happen with the owners of space and place, so to me, that's cities and private real estate owners, is the place and space, like the square feet is just the platform to do stuff. How do we sort of like, create the ways for people to build things from these places and spaces to connect and to grow and to be able to experiment. I think, innovation is all about not maximizing freedom and speed, not minimizing risk. And so much of that sort of conversation that sort of happens right now is trying to sort of find those sort of solutions and manage risk instead of trying to figure out what works, what doesn't. And so we're spending less time trying to advocate for something, but sort of spending more time, taking action and being able to sort of do that stuff.
I mean, can you respond just quickly to Sadhu, and then I'm going to go to Jay, around this notion of partnership? That Sadhu said we need a collective horizontal partnership of different stakeholders in this discussion, an inclusive one so everyone's involved. How willing do you think the business community is to have those tough conversations?
Yeah, so there's a word, we talk a lot right now about just shared investment and co-investment. And this is this thing about placemaking and city building. It's like, it's right now it's supposed to belong to sort of somebody, where right now it's just like, well, landlords have to be placemakers too because they own the space.
So you want it to belong to everybody.
And we want, exactly. And when you think about, the space and the real estate is just, it's the commodity, right? It's what you do with the space that sort of matters. And I think like we've gone from this like local to global and now back to sort of local again. Mm-hmm. And thinking about, because we're so connected from our cities, but we can be connected with other people in other cities too. Mm-hmm. It's how do you sort of create that really great, that strength from your own backyard. And
do you think you can decommodify the real estate though? Because that's the dilemma. That's a colonial structure that you're reinforcing, right? Yeah. And that's the dilemma that we've got. The power relationship here is completely tilted. And that's what I'm sure Jay's going to, I don't want to put words in Jay's mouth, but I'm going to pass to Jay next and then to Sadhu. Next 100 days, folks, we only got 6 minutes left. Jay, next 100 days, thoughts?
Picking up on what Ken said, and I've been talking about this idea of ethical rule breaking. I think that we need to highlight the ethical rule breakers. The state is moving too slowly. The rules that exist are profoundly inequitable. The bylaws, all of the things that govern our cities. And so I think that we really want to lean into and celebrate ethical rule breakers, and the state should follow those ethical rule breakers. Mm-hmm. I would also like to see this report, which I think is a great report. I read every single word of the first one, and I'll be reading this one as well as soon as I get an opportunity. My wish for the next one is to get those voices of people who are on the streets. So can we find a way to not just give them a nod or acknowledge them? How can we center them? Wouldn't it be wonderful for 300 days, when we get to the 300-day point, for folks like you and I to be get out of the way and to be watching folks who are on the street level, are essential workers, as well as people involved in street involved activities, for them to be the ones to teach us and for us to listen to them. And the third thing that I'd like to see happen within the next 100 days is to be really thinking about social cohesion and people's mental wellness. I think that will be critical. Canadian winters are already so difficult to get through. Right? So Can you imagine being someone from an equity-seeking group or living in inadequate housing, or someone with a challenge with substances within this context, making it through? We need to figure out from the state level and also informal local levels, how are we going to support people and keep them connected and supported through merciless, I'm Jamaican, so I'm exaggerative about the cold, merciless Canadian winters. I'll stop there.
I love the ethical rule breakers. Let's hear it for ethical rule breakers. The other related concept that I've been adopting is desire paths. This idea that planners often have great plans about this is where the park will be and this is what it'll look like. And then people say, no, actually, this is the walkway I want. So there is a moment we're at here where we can pay attention to what are the desire paths of everyone. And are we going to be able to match the obligation and the responsibility we have to respond to that? Sadhu, last word to you in terms of as steward of one of Canada's great cities. What do you see as the next 100-day challenge for you?
Well, thanks. Continuing to provide the basic services as workers are challenged to come into work and are facing sickness and needing to take care of their loved ones. Basic services like washrooms, a lot of cafes and places are no longer providing that service. And so people that don't have their own homes have nowhere to go. And so figuring out, we're getting more trailers and things like that. The basic services that people rely on us to help provide. So really figuring out how to be creative, housing more people. Like we have a housing crisis, we have a homelessness crisis. It's all exacerbated and it's going to get harder and harder. And so really tackling the housing crisis, particularly as we head into winter, we've got a lot of people living on the street. And so trying to work with, we now have an election happening in the province in the midst of all of this. And so partners that we need at the table can't be at the table with us. So I think those are, it sounds kind of simple, but I guess running a city, those kind of services are absolutely critical. Where do people go to the bathroom if they don't have your own apartment? We need to be working on those kinds of things, helping to get menstrual products delivered in those washrooms and things like that. So I think, we need to be continuing to focus on some of the basics as we continue to get libraries back up and running and computer labs for people. And so we'll be working on many of those types of issues as we head into winter, and vulnerable people are made more vulnerable.
It underscores just the list of things that you just listed off. To me, is just breathtaking in terms of what municipal government is responsible for in Canada. And I mean, did everybody just listen to that list and just feel tired? Like, it is remarkable that this level of government has to continue to operate that way. So, Sadhu, any thoughts in terms of the structural challenge you've got in municipal government life in Canada with the provinces and the federal government holding so much of the power and the money?
Well, I mean, I think that's the primary challenge. You look at all the services that local government provides, and how close we are to residents in our communities, be they folks with homes or not. And we just don't have the financial tools to take them on. And I think that is a major problem with cities in Canada generally. I mean, 8 cents of every tax dollar goes to cities, but you think about roads and all the different things that we are working to provide to our residents. So I think that is a conversation we collectively need to have in this country, is if we want vibrant, urban, equitable communities, like how do we make sure that the resources are going to make that happen? Because otherwise, it's not going to happen by itself.
And it is interesting that the civil rights uprising that Jay cited earlier, those protests have been happening on city streets. And people experience their sense of whether their rights are being protected or not in the community in which they live. And 85%, 84% of Canadians are living in urban communities and cities. So it's a huge challenge. Last word to you, Andre, as you head into COVID 300.
Well, I think, I'd spoken a little bit earlier about, thinking ahead, and I think the report captures a little bit of that. What I was going to leave on was, there's been a fair amount of talk about the homelessness challenges, and I would just point people to a really powerful piece that Alison Ashcroft wrote about the BC Perspectives piece about her experience in Victoria, and it's both uplifting and hugely reinforcing of the challenges, but that there's been some progress, and that there have been cases where communities can really kind of come together around that issue. So I would just leave it there. I think that's something that I'd recommend people check out.
Alison's piece is the regional perspective from British Columbia, and it's part of the COVID 200 report. You can find it at canurb.org. Listen, thanks everybody, Andre, Ken, Sadhu, and Jay. Really important conversation. As we always say, the topics that we cover here at City Talk don't finish at these sessions, they continue. They're the beginning of they continue to be an ongoing conversation, so please continue it at #CityTalk. Tomorrow, very timely chat about how are we going to cope with winter? Brr. And what our Jamaican confrere just mentioned, it's not a time that lots of folks find very easy to cope with. So residents across the country are going to be challenged by this. Our mental health is going to be challenged by this. And we're going to have to get through. So please, I hope you'll join Catherine Craig St. Louis, who is the COI regional lead in Quebec. And first time for us, we're actually doing the session en deux langues. So it will be in French and English simultaneously. And I hope you will join us to have a conversation about what can we learn from others, what are we going to experiment with, and how are we going to get through the winter. So thanks everybody. We'll see you this week as City Talk continues. And we appreciate you looking at COVID 200 and thinking for yourselves what you can do and what our actions need to be collectively. Thanks everybody.
Thanks, Mary.
Thanks.